We are live now, so welcome everyone to Liturgy Live. My name is Alanna Burg, and this is Father Ian Van Heusen. We are going to be talking about the 26th Sunday in Ordinary Time. All right, Father Ian, lead us in.
Yeah, so I just like to start with a little bit of an opening monologue. It sometimes relates to what we're going to talk about, sometimes it doesn't, because we just kind of have a spirit-led conversation. But one of the things I was taken away from this week's readings, especially if you read the gospel in light of the first reading, is when God works outside of established patterns. And so we see in the first reading where the spirit of prophecy comes on those who aren't present when Moses imparts that spirit of prophecy and that spirit of governance on the people he's appointed as leaders. And then we see in the gospel where Jesus is confronted with the question of somebody who is using his name to drive out demons, but is not a part of the official organization. I know we're particularly mindful of this as Catholics in around a predominantly Protestant area, where we're dealing a lot of times with non-Catholics, we're dealing with folks of other denominations, and yet we're always amazed that sometimes they can do great work. In fact, many of you may not know this, but my video guy and the guy I work with a lot is actually not Catholic. So it's a fascinating dynamic that we recognize, and this is kind of an important teaching, we recognize that the most efficacious way that we're saved is through a relationship with Jesus that's present in the sacraments. That's the surest and safest way. But yet we know so often wisdom sometimes comes from outside of that system. We see it, and we're going to talk, maybe I'll talk about this more. We'll see how the conversation goes. But we also see the early church fathers, they talk about the wisdom of the pagans, particularly Plato and Aristotle. In our own time, I think I'm a big fan of the positive psychology movement. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom that comes out of that, even though a lot of those aren't Christian as well. So let's jump in. Are we ready to go? Have we shared it with everybody? Is everybody able to follow along?
Yeah, I believe that it has been shared. And for those of you who are watching right now, please give us a share and let us know where you're joining us from, and let us know what your prayers are for this week.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Let's jump into the readings.
Yeah. So the first reading is from the book of Numbers. The Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to Moses. Taking some of the spirit that was on Moses, the Lord bestowed it on the 70 elders. And as the Spirit came to rest on them, they prophesied. Now 2 men, one named Eldad and the other Medad, were not in the gathering, but had been left in the camp. They too had been on the list, but had not gone out to the tent. Yet the Spirit came to rest on them also, and they prophesied in the camp. So when the young man quickly told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp, Joshua son of Nun, who from his youth had been Moses' aide, said to Moses, Moses, my Lord, stop them. But Moses answered him, Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the people of the Lord were prophets. Would that the Lord might bestow his spirit on them all. Okay, so this comes at a very interesting point in the story, the salvation history story with Moses. They have already received everything on Mount Sinai. They have left Mount Sinai. It's been 3 days of travel from Mount Sinai towards the Promised Land. So this is before they get to the Promised Land and send the 12 in. You know, it's before the 40 years of wandering in the desert. So It's before any of that. What's happening? 3 days in, they're complaining again about food. They talk about how they are the vagabonds in the group have eaten all the quail, so there's no meat. So God is providing the manna and the meat, but there's not enough for everyone because of greed. And Moses complains kind of to God and says, why do you give me these people? Like he's like 3 days in and done already. and he says to them, okay, if this is going to be it, just kill me now. Like I would rather you just like I can't be this cross is too heavy for me, is basically what he's saying. Yeah. And so God tells him to bring together the 70 elders. And so the 70 elders were for the ability to God to speak and use them. So the burden wasn't completely on Moses through this whole, it was mostly on Moses, but wasn't completely on Moses. So that is your background for.
That's some great background. So we see that there's a sense that Moses is delegating authority through this. So he's delegating authority, which I think there's a first thing that we can talk about is that delegation of authority first. So there's the 70 elders that he delegates. Did you get into the way the numbers work and how? I'm trying to remember who it was. I believe it was Jethro who came up with the idea for him to delegate authority. I believe, was it Jethro, his father-in-law?
Not in this story.
Not in this account.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, because I'm trying to think how that. Because there was Jethro came up with the idea, and I think it's in the Office of Readings, where Moses delegated the authority and basically created a hierarchy. So point to 70 or point to whatever number it was, and then they will appoint people below them, and we'll divide until we get everybody into units of 10, basically like a military structure, or like any structure of delegation that we have. So I guess the first question is first thing we can start off with is that sense of delegating authority. Like that's one of those classic critiques of a leader. If a leader doesn't know how to delegate, what do you think does that mean normally when they say a leader doesn't know how to delegate? What do you think?
I think it might be the leader is taking too much upon himself, too much responsibility.
Yeah.
For all of that. And just like what Moses was doing, like it was too much for one person. You know, but he went straight to God and said, all right, God, you know, this is on you. This is your job to help me with this. Or kill me because like, that's what I got. You know, he's like, I can't move forward 3 days into the journey. They're being ridiculous toddlers. And I feel like that's humanity in general. We're still like this. We haven't really grown.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I don't know. Did you get a chance that you listened to my podcast with the whole management thing? My idea that I presented, did you hear that? Or do I need to summarize that real quick? I should probably summarize that anyways.
You should summarize it for the other people.
Yeah,
I read it.
So one of the things I talked about, one of my critiques right now of the Catholic Church is a purely practical level, which is for the most part, like in a diocese like mine, which is a small diocese. So keep in mind that small diocese, the way the management structure works is my next report. So I have a pastor, but actually for ECU Newman, I don't have a pastor because for the Newman Center, I'm my own boss. But my next level of authority is there is a diocesan official who oversees it, but he oversees like all of the schools and he's the superintendent, wears multiple hats. So really, for the most part, there's not a whole lot of management goes on. So normally when they talk about management, the going wisdom is that you can effectively manage about 5 or 6 people. And this is across professions. So normally you have a report to of 5 people who report to you. And you see with the Moses structure in the Old Testament, there's somewhere around that number. They maybe could go a little bit higher, that you have like an inner circle of say 10 or 12. I think 12 would be an obvious number with Jesus. But even within that, there's a hierarchy that Jesus makes of 3, is that you really want to have those, because what I'm learning even now is there's only so many hours in the day. So you could have all the energy in the world. You could have all the good ideas in the world, but your ability to physically sit down and talk with somebody is limited. So you have to choose and calculate, especially as the organizations get bigger. So one of my critiques is that there's not a whole lot of management that's going on. So I don't know, what are your initial thoughts on that? Did you see how I'm kind of relating that to the reading in the sense of delegating?
I do see how that relates. And it's interesting because I don't know how, even with the 70 elders in the days of Moses, they still had tribes of people. So they would have had to delegate underneath them some sort of process, which I'm not exactly sure of because they complain for 40 years. So, you know, so that's kind of how that turns out, as we know. But
maybe that was part of the whole thing, was to create the organizational structures that would, to teach them how to be leaders, how to form them. Yeah.
Right.
Like, well, did your, like, because your husband was in the Army, right?
He's Air Force.
Air Force. Oh, sorry.
Your Army.
So my dad's Army, and he, they would have different training schools, and you always had that sense of like training periods to train officers or senior enlisted or whatever it might be. And maybe that's a big part of the desert experience, was to train Israel on how to manage the affairs of the nation, how to be, raise up leaders, effective leaders. And, because actually I apply this principle with marriage prep. I joke around with couples I work with that it's always good if there's like a little bit of a crisis that happens. Generally speaking, most of my current ones haven't had crises, but that's why I say, I say to couple, I like to meet with them the last few times, 3 times, closer to the wedding, because then what happens is the fireworks start to happen. And so there's some real good stuff and I think there was even a movie that joked around about it, but in that sense of trial and crisis, you find out how people communicate, how they work together, how they cooperate. And I think what we're seeing is the Lord's bringing the ancient Israelites and trying to form that sense of hierarchy, a sense of structure in them through this kind of desert experience.
Right. Yes. I also see the reason why I went so in depth into the background is because the rest of the readings this week will be looking also into greed. So this is the response. God's response to someone's greed was this and to Moses's prayer, but was this delegation of people, of elders to look after the people, to secure them. What happens right after they are delegated and prophesy is that there are so much quail that comes that there is a famine and the greedy people perish. So it's interesting that it's like kind of couched in a way, kind of like how Mark writes his gospel, is couched in the middle of this bigger story of these 70 elders receiving the Spirit and prophesying, but in between the story of greed. So okay. It also has a lot to do with, so the readings this week, the other ones, we'll be talking a lot about the sin of greed.
Oh, that's interesting. That's an angle I picked up on immediately. We'll flesh that out a little bit. What do you think? Why do you think it was important to delegate authority in the midst of greed?
Well, I think when it comes to people who are greedy, more eyes help for people to feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that because somebody's watching me. And it's definitely interesting in terms of community when you feel like, oh, I shouldn't, even if their immediate desire is wrong, if they feel like if they feel like they would be subject to some sort of authority, that they are their desires are a little bit curbed towards doing what's right.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. I mean, actually, this is something that you have to deal with on a regular basis in parish dynamics. So you always build into any system checks. So there's checks that I have that so I see, monthly statements, bank statements, things like that. That's part of what it means to be a parish priest. You have to go through those. And then also with the collection on Sunday, there's different procedures that are in place in most parishes. And it's actually standardized across the diocese, which, to make a little bit of a plug, sometimes people complain about, what does the diocese do? What is that centralized authority? They seem so distant. Well, actually, a lot of times what they do is they provide oversight, particularly the financial oversight, which can be very important. They do a lot of checks and they track numbers and they do different things to make sure parishes are on track with that accountability to account for greed.
Right. So what you're saying is that not always it's not all negative when it comes to you don't have a lot of time and you can only have you can only really delegate to 5 people, but in terms of the diocesan, that they really have a hold on being able to check the financial situation out. So there's just other situations that they need to work harder on. Yeah.
The finances, because the way it works is the diocese itself doesn't manage the financial oversight. What it is they have finance committees, So every parish has a finance committee, and they report to the diocese. And so there's always, within every parish, there's built-in checks and balances, more on the financial side. So maybe that's an interesting thing. Like right now, the emphasis on managing is more on the financial side, but the moral side perhaps is lacking. That's actually something I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah.
And actually,
and you brought, that's what you brought to my attention, that I noticed that it was like, oh, so they're doing something right. Yay.
yeah.
We can look at that from a good perspective.
Yeah. And I think I think a big reason why they're able to do all of that is because when it comes to the finances versus the moral theological side, that's mostly run by lay people in a diocese. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's just be honest. That oversight is 90% of it is done by lay people, whereas lay people have almost no oversight on the moral lives of priests. Yeah, I think that would be the way to put it. Yeah. Now, I don't know if that should change though. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think
the idea of having more eyes.
Yeah.
For not necessarily like authority in the way it's normally used in the church, but authority as in like you're going to be held accountable.
Yeah.
And your morality is now actually being watched. Do you know what I mean?
So the idea of religious orders and religious communities, why they're able often to produce a higher quality of priest, is because a lot of times there's just that built-in accountability. Right. That they focus on living in community.
Great. So you ready for some comments?
Yeah, let's see what do folks got to say.
Okay. Ryan Fisher says, "Hi, Father Ian and Alanna. It's Ryan from Louisville, Kentucky. Pleasure."
You're still not saying it right.
It's Louisville.
Louisville.
Okay, but he's spelled it out for me sound-wise. Louisville. And he says, "Pleasure and blessed to be here again with you all." So Ryan, thank you for being an awesome regular.
Man.
For being gracious with me and spelling it out sound-wise, because that's the best. Elizabeth says, "Hello, Father Ian and Alanna." Hello, Elizabeth.
Yeah. And what's your last name?
Elizabeth Widener. Ashball Widener.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's a parishioner.
All right. Hey. Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And Ryan Fisher says, "Community is an important aspect of this week's readings. God's Spirit is a gift freely given, imparted upon a community of believers, i.e. parishes, dioceses, and the church, and not just a few select individuals." Mm-hmm. Good point. That's a really good thought to think about as we move forward too with these other readings. Absolutely. So if anybody else wants to tell us where you're from, share our stream to your friends, and any prayer requests so we can pray them at the end. So that's just the update before you're ready for the next reading.
Yeah, let's go.
All right, we're again in the book of James. "Come now, you rich, weep and wail over your impending miseries. Your wealth has rotted away. Your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and that corrosion will be a testimony against you. It will devour your flesh like a fire. You will have stored up treasure for the last days. Behold, the wages you withheld from the workers who harvested your fields are crying aloud, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the righteous one. He offers you no resistance." All right. This is fairly self-explanatory in the sense of the greed, and James is preaching to other Christians who have become greedy with their own material wealth. They specifically the wages one is from in Leviticus. They're called to pay each day's wages, so they weren't taking advantage of the workers. Yeah. And there was one other thing that This really, to me, has a sense of with the ending of the story of the first reading, where all of the quail, like they get so much quail that it rots, and then it kills them with the plague. So in the sense of, the irony of when you wish for too much, then it comes.
One thing that occurred to me while you were kind of talking about it that I think would be worth a little bit of a conversation, and then we can get back to the question of greed, is the idea of justice. So, I've been doing research on St. Alphonsus Liguori, and the classical understanding of moral law as there's a kind of justice and of course we're called to exceed the law, but, some people read Jesus's words or St. Paul's words and say, well, that whole law, legal system, that's outdated, and now we're in grace, and we don't need all of those rules. We just need. But it's funny though, because everybody recognizes the importance of a legal system when it comes to money, right? Like justice. I mean, right now we even recognize, like, with the multiple ways that you can invest money. Like, you remember the banking crisis, right? Remember the injustices that were reigning with the banking crisis, where banks went unchecked. And it's like, why don't we see the same need for accountability with, like, our sexual lives? Or almost on people view them on opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, it's totally okay for checks and balances with money, but somehow what I do in the bedroom is not at all. There's not a continuity in principles of how human nature works.
Yeah. The sexual sins are like the Voldemort of sins. Like, they're the ones that must not be named. You know what I mean? Like, they must not be talked about in public sphere. Which is our culture right now. Absolutely. Like, what does it mean to have that type of accountability? Because in the culture, like, according to the culture, there is no sin in you know what I mean? So they don't believe in sin. So it's very interesting to see, because it's also becoming quite puritanical on the other end of the spectrum. So it's becoming this what's the word I'm looking for? Where things are, it's really polarized, but that's not the word I was looking for.
I think fragmented, or like one idea that Pope Benedict XVI talked about is the hermeneutics of continuity. And so this idea of continuity, now he meant it more in terms of theology. So the Old Testament's fulfilled in the New. There's continuity. There's continuity in the early church. But I think even within different realms of human experience, like sports are governed by rules. We know that justice in the world is governed by rules and by laws and proper jurisprudence and interpretation of laws. Why wouldn't there be something analogous to our personal lives or to our spiritual lives? Why do we view those things as almost like completely separated? Like that somehow laws and rules work over here, but over here they are problematic. It's the same human nature, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think it's only problematic because they don't want to see themselves in sin, so they work around it as it's not a sin. So it's not necessarily that it's not true. It's just that they are living as if it's not true in that way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And I think we'd have, like, and that's why I think for me, starting to formulate this idea that, like, law and order, because sometimes people will say, well, Americans don't like hierarchy and they don't like law and order. Actually, Americans love law and order when it comes to their traffic, when it comes to their roads, when it comes to their government, and when it comes to rules governing finances and, espionage. And, everybody likes a good law and order and good justice, right? I think we all value that. It's just we somehow completely disconnect that from our spiritual life.
Yeah. They want the law and order to be from themselves. You know what I mean? It's good because it works for me, but when it comes from God, the authority of God, it's almost they have been taught that it's a tyranny.
That's a great point to make. Even I think Kant and some of the modernist philosophers would get into it, says, well, you're weak if you need an outside authority. or if you should just be good on your own initiative. It's almost like somehow bad if somebody tells you. But the thing is you first learn, and this actually St. Paul gets at why we needed the Old Testament and why we need the law, is you first learn to form your conscience by being exposed to the rules. Another dynamic we're having to deal with right now in the Catholic Church, and I have to deal with this a lot actually, from good people. They're not really bad people. Like, they're really faithful. A lot of times people who want to do what's good, but their consciences were malformed. And so they're not aware of things that they're doing. And then they slowly learn over time, oh, this is bad. I shouldn't be doing this. And right now we're facing that a lot in the Catholic Church, that, I'm the first one that a person might be in their 20s, 30s, or 40s or later, and they're hearing for the first time that X, Y, and Z is a sin. And they're like, oh, really? And I do think they're being genuine.
No, I do think that that's a real problem that we have to deal with. And also when it comes to in the church, like, I think part of the problem is that people aren't having a real relationship with Christ or an encounter with Christ. So they're seeing these rules and they don't have the relationship to want to even like look at them, or to even feel like that this is what's good for me, because they don't have that relationship with the Christ to guide that, to, for that desire to be there. So when we're looking at Old Testament, yes, they needed the revelation, and they needed, they were shown how much God loves them, multiple times, but they were still really difficult. And we're still difficult, but we have the grace of Christ, and we have a relationship with God in a more direct way. That moral theology is able to be desired.
Absolutely. Exactly.
So
exactly. And that's kind of like, I talk a lot about like a holistic view. I love that word, because sometimes people normally associate with people who disagree with some of my positions, but holistic, where yes, the relationship, the intimacy, that friendship, but also the legal side, like that there is law and order, that there is an interpretation of law. There is a system. There is, in a certain sense, even St. Alphonsus Liguori would say the role of the priest is to act as the judge and to help you to discern tough cases of conscience.
Mm-hmm. We actually have a lot of comments. So cool. Maria says, hello, I'm watching from Slovakia. Welcome, Maria. Thank you for joining us. Elizabeth, awesome. Your parishioner, says, wisdom. Discussing the Sunday readings yesterday, I thought instantly about wisdom. I envisioned 3 witches around plotting dastardly deed against Jesus, which ties to the greed that is discussed in James. These witches are opposed to the law, like you are saying, Father Ian. What struck me in this reading is the word compliant. It seems to like we live in a society opposed to compliancy. Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. And I think if we can just show people that, like, because we all recognize, like I said, with finances, we all recognize pretty immediately. Yeah.
It's also easier because it's very detailed. Finances are so detailed. You know what I mean? Like, it's black and white, and it's not like hidden so much as the other sins that we've been discussing. And she also says we were talking about rationalization, basically, when we were talking about when people feel like they don't have to do what it says, and they rationalize why. And I'm going to butcher this name. Vitus says best wishes from Lithuania. Thank you for watching with us.
Oh, nice.
Elizabeth also says, and nature desires law and order. Children function much better in an orderly and secure atmosphere, far better than in a world or family without clear authority. That's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
They respond better when they know they're loved. So I think that's also an important part to remember, that it's not just law and authority from a perspective. Sometimes from children's perspective, it's very you have to do this, and it's not. They don't see it as coming from a place from love, which some of us also, need to know that God's law and authority is coming from a place from love.
Absolutely.
Ryan says, this reading reminds me about the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12. Store your wealth and build bigger barns rather than sharing with the community.
Yeah.
Yep. Except for that's not the gospel reading. It would work well though, Ryan. I agree. Jennifer Convery says, I'm coming into the conversation a bit late, but I feel like a lot of people are already in a life or relationships that is against the laws or rules, and they don't know how to make it right. That is a big problem.
That's a whole nother issue. Let's talk about that a little bit, because that's actually an interesting case. I hesitate to open this can of worms, but I think this is part of the question. I don't know if I agree with some of the interpretations of the answer, but that I think Pope Francis has drawn our attention to in a good way, which is there's what we're striving for. And in a lot of that field hospital imagery is very accurate. I work with a lot of folks that they're on the way. They're on the way. They are in some regards living in mortal sin, and you're trying to get them to take one step at a time. And I think one of the real challenges I've learned as a priest that's hard to describe is it's like you never have enough time to walk with people the way you would want to. So I've learned I had to really be patient with the process and just recognize my own limitations. So you get that confession where somebody's on the way and there's some aspects of mortal sin in their life you need to address, you need to work on, and you just kind of got to be patient with the process. I think that's where, unfortunately, a lot of like conservative and traditionalist priests sometimes go amok, is they're not patient with that process of conversion. They want it all to happen immediately. They want everybody to live up to the law and I'll just explain it to you one time, super clear. And it's like, it's a process. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really a good point also for the rest of us we're not there in confession, but if we know somebody who is struggling, or if they let us know that they're struggling, but they want to make those steps, that we also, as the rest of the body of Christ, are patient with them, and don't exclude them in the ways of, by loving them as Christ loved us. So
absolutely.
I think that's one of the harder things for being a parishioner. You know what I mean? I don't know if I've necessarily recently had to deal with this. Our parish is so huge. I don't really know anybody yet moving in. So I don't really know other people's struggles, or, their sins are not apparent to me. So I don't have to deal. It's nice to not have to even know or deal with that. Not that that's good. It's just, a little bit of a reprieve. But to know how we might act, how we might be more accepting to people who are actively on the way, and not actively rejecting. So I think that's important.
Absolutely. And the neat thing is, I've been talking about it on my Art of Living Well discussion group, and we can't really flesh it out here, but some of the beauty of the teachings on conscience and the law and how the law works, according to St. Alphonsus Liguori and the tradition that he's coming out of, which was somewhat abandoned after Vatican II, called casuistry. And it's fascinating. It really does accommodate that sense that there's a middle ground where people are striving to do what they think is best, but their conscience may have been malformed. And how does that work? Because one of the teachings that helped me a lot pastorally from St. Alphonsus Liguori, and I might be putting this in an article, is an invincibly erroneous conscience. And he talks about, one of the debates they had is, if you act on an invincibly erroneous conscience, does it merit grace? And I'll give you an example. I'm trying to figure out a way of putting this to kind of cloak what I'm talking about. So let's say you had a parish. And let's say there's a procedure that the church gives for whatever it might be. Let's say with give me an example. What do you think of something that Catholics do on a regular basis that they might get wrong? Some procedure or something, or I'm trying to think. There's one I'm thinking that's obvious, or just something little. Oh, the fast, the hour fast before Mass. This is a good one. This is a good one, and it's a different one than from the one that I've encountered in my own parish. So,
really quick. Is your hand on your mic? It's wonky.
Oh, no, it's not.
Okay, keep going then.
Oh, is it? What's wrong with it?
It was just going. It was kind of like muffled and then not muffled and then muffled.
Oh, because I was moving my hand.
Oh, okay.
Talking with my hand, so I'll talk with my right hand.
Okay.
Thanks for the heads up.
All right, the hour of fast. That's where you were at.
So the hour of fast. One of those rules that it's not immediately clear that that's a sin, right? Or that's I don't know if you would say grave matter, but a sin nonetheless, right? A sin that should be confessed if you're breaking on a regular basis. And so you're the good, faithful Catholic who's learned that and believes it with all your heart. And then you see somebody chowing down on a cheeseburger 10 minutes before Mass, right? Or let's say this, that they're feeding their children before Mass. Maybe they're feeding their kids who have a soccer game afterwards or whatever. And let's say they're over the age of reason so they can receive communion. And so obviously they're breaking the law, so to speak. But this teaching accounts for is if they have an erroneous conscience that's invincible, the idea that it's not their fault, like maybe they weren't really explained it, and they didn't really internalize it. There is a sense that maybe they're doing a good thing, even though they're breaking the law. Now, it depends. We have to be cautious. Certain kinds of laws are closer to what's called the natural law. So like if you have an erroneous conscience that thinks that murder is okay, well, that's never good. That's never good. It's hard to explain. It's like there's this nuance within the church teaching that allows for just being pastoral. Yeah.
So the good that it would be was that they were feeding their children.
Yeah, something like that. Exactly.
Okay.
It's an imperfect example. Though another one example is a little bit clearer, but I just can't give it because it would give away some things I got to work on. My parishioners are going to be like, But, that's the problem with being spontaneous.
Yeah.
But
Elizabeth, just two more
comments.
Elizabeth said, Alanna hit it on the head. The relationship with Christ is crucial for the compliance in the natural law of God. It's absolutely necessary. Jennifer says, I'm so grateful for priests like Father Ian who are willing to take up the time to show Christ's love and patience to help them slowly find the way. So good job, Father Ian. High five. Yeah.
Embarrassing me a little bit.
I know. He didn't ask for this praise. So there you go. It's no praise greediness over here. Okay. Are you ready for the gospel?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. From the Gospel of Mark. At the time, John said to Jesus, Teacher, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow us. Jesus replied, Do not prevent him. There is no one who performs a mighty deed in my name who can at the same time speak ill of me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Everyone who gives a cup of water to drink, because you belong to Christ, amen, I say to you, will surely not lose his reward. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were to put around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed than with two hands to go into Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life crippled than with 2 feet to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into Gehenna, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. All right. Great. So this gospel, it jumps around. So it's not from one specific passage. It kind of like jumps from one passage to the next passage.
Yeah.
So for the first one, there's an obvious connection to the first reading. Mm-hmm. And interesting that John says he does not follow us necessarily. Like he still doesn't quite understand that it's following Christ specifically. in that section. And that miracles in his name are to honor him, is not competition. You know, he's, the apostles and him are not in competition with this person who is actually doing these miracles in his name. So would you want to talk about the first part?
I actually was going to pick your brain a little bit, because you had this whole dimension of greed, and I was like, I mean, I'm kind of working with you, but I'm like, I didn't see it in the gospel, so I just would be curious how you connected that.
Well, part of it is the causes to sin. You know, the greed of, you know, the greed in the first part a little bit is they want all the accolades, and they want to be the ones who are doing the deeds for Christ.
Gotcha.
They have it's, maybe it's more pride, but it's they don't want the greed of not wanting others to have it.
Yeah.
The avarice of that.
Yeah. So technically speaking, more like envy and pride. Right.
So maybe not specifically greed, but in terms of connecting it to the first reading, it's obvious that the connections between, like, not being jealous for his sake. So most of it, a few of my notes are on the second part. So let's talk about the first part first.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about it. So we have greed, we have this sense of envy, and because we went in a different direction than I was thinking initially, which is fun, because it's that's the beauty of doing this, is for me, is that it doesn't always go the direction I want, which is helpful. that keeps me from getting stuck in a rut. So greed, envy.
Well, also, okay, so the other note I have is for whoever is with us / against us line is Christ's automatic call for us, for each and every one of us to decide if we are with Christ or if we are not with Christ. So that brings apart, not necessarily for the greed part, but I feel like it's a response to, it's his response to the sin of their wanting to be the ones that, you know.
Yeah, makes sense.
In the club.
Makes sense. And we have that envy part. Well, then there's one direction we could take it is, I'm sure you've encountered this or have heard of it at least, is the whole idea of being territorial in a parish. Like, you have your territory, you have your area, and, you know, heaven forbid somebody kind of does something within your area.
Who do they think they are?
Yeah. I guess, you know, that's always a question, what that tendency, because I think one of the dynamics I've started to, and we're going to see how this is going to play out in the next year at St. Peter and ECU Newman. But one concept that I've heard talked about, they talk about a scarcity mindset. And so people always think of their time and their energy and their money as being finite, which it is in a certain regard. But one principle that I've believed, I've talked about this before, is the principle of synergy, which is there can be a multiplying effect when you invest in the proper things. So I've seen this with the parish. I've seen it a lot with the Art of Living Well. So one of the things I've really focused on doing with Art of Living Well is investing in the broader community. And so it was a deliberate choice that me and Tim made, especially when I came to St. Peter's. We started doing content that didn't feature me, that featured other things from the community. And that kind of multiplying effect, because it's a really funny dynamic in Greenville. It's like, because the economy is so small that you really see it. It's like you literally go to the restaurant, buy the food, then they make a donation to the church, or it's like, and the money circulates. And there's this principle of synergy that takes place, that as people are cooperating, it's like there's a multiplying effect. And sometimes I think where people have a hard time with that is you can't control that process, that you have to sometimes let things happen beyond your control. I know a lot of pastors have a hard time with that because they want to control everything. But sometimes you have to allow these things to happen and these kind of synergistic relationships and this kind of cooperation to take place.
And as long as they're doing good. Because the person who is driving out demons was doing good deeds in his name. So it would be a different situation if they were cursing people in Jesus's name. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that was part of the point that you really should find allies within the community, you know what I mean, that aren't necessarily in your tribe. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. And we're even more aware of this in like a town like Greenville where, you know, the mayor is Catholic, but, you know, there's we're all working with non-Catholics, all of us. And it's not like a Catholic dominated area. And those relationships are just as important. And building that synergy outside of the visible structures of the church.
We have a comment from Jennifer. She says, sin of pride, ? Yes, absolutely. So it's not just greed this time. So sorry, that was my original thought. So maybe it was.
Yeah, well, and this is where I've been like ruminating on the 7 deadly sins and some of this like these doctrines, and like pride. One way to look at pride is disordered love for honor. So like over the love of honor can lead to pride, but it's also connected a little bit with envy, because envy is when you have sadness at the good of somebody else. So you see somebody else doing something good and you feel sad and you feel upset about it. So you think of it as evil, even though it's good. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I've been chewing a lot on St. Thomas Aquinas, man. It's fun stuff, man.
It is fun stuff.
It's fun stuff.
Jen says, well, an inability to delegate is also pride. And the idea that I'm the only one who can do this right is also, so that's an interesting point. Thanks, Jen.
And then that draws out a great point. If you've ever worked in an organization, when you delegate, one of the hardest parts of delegating is people generally don't do things exactly the way you would do them, right? So that's like,
was it also something to be greedy about? Like, if they aren't doing it the way that you want them to do it, is your way greed? Or is that just...
Yeah, I mean, we're stretching the meaning of greed.
I know. Okay, I'm reaching really far.
No, I don't think it's bad. Okay, so this is where it's not always good for the church to be dominated by philosophers and theologians, right? We need some poets. And that's where poetry has a certain, you can play with the language, and play with the meaning. So like a greed for power is, we talk about that greed for power. And a lot of that is based on control. Yeah.
Jen says, I'm in my rut. And she said, greed is everywhere. Greed for power, greed for the sexual sins, greed for all the money. It's everywhere. Okay. So the next section, the Millstone gospel reading. So I find this to be so relevant. I was wondering when it was going to come up, because I have actually heard this quote multiple times over the last few weeks of the scandal, and I feel like it's really interesting because in this reading, technically, multiple times this is talking about scandal, because causing people to sin. If you put something in the way of someone that causes them to sin, that is technically, according to the church, scandal.
Yeah.
So this is literally a reading about scandal.
Yeah.
Not necessarily scandal as our culture uses the word, which is like, but scandal as in if you cause somebody else to sin, then you are responsible for that sin.
Yeah.
So I really think that's an interesting.
And this was one of the interesting conversations that's being had on the internet, and I haven't delved into it a lot, and I don't profess to have the answer to it. But one of the things that's traditionally been understood that I think everybody agrees on is telling the truth and exposing injustices, exposing people's sins, you always have to be careful. And this is where the traditional teaching was it should be done in a way that builds up the body of Christ. And I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. I'm not condemning anybody in particular. Right now, to be honest with you, overall, even sources I tend to disagree with their tenor. I think it's good that a lot of these sources are having these difficult conversations right now, because my biggest fear with a lot of the issues going on right now is that we're just going to try to pretend like nothing happened and not address it. And what's going to happen is it's kind of like what happens like when there's abuse in a family or there's a tragedy in a family, and you just say, we're just not going to talk about it. We're going to pretend like it's not there. Well, it's still there. It's still simmering. Everybody still recognizes it. It's just not being dealt with. And that's my biggest concern is that right now is that my biggest concern is not scandal in the sense that somebody is going to be shocked by the idea that priests are sinners or that, whatever it might be, or that whatever, there's a lot of different things that are being floated around. My biggest concern is just we're not going to address it and not have good conversations.
Right. I think one of the scandals, like the biggest stumbling blocks for people is the opportunity to throw hate. And that is like such a hard, I don't like using necessarily that term because it's so overused right now in our culture, but to have unrighteous anger, to condemn people unrighteous, like in sinful anger because of it. You know what I mean? It's led them to sin in that way, which still damages the body of Christ. So that to me is kind of where I see some of the causing of others' sin, of the generalized people who have been scandalized. You know what I mean? Yeah. Where they're led more into sins of anger and sins of, in that realm.
Yeah.
Which I don't, and then if they fall away because of it, then how are we going to deal with it?
Yeah. This is a tough one because as much as you're absolutely right, that point is absolutely 100% correct. I just do sometimes worry an overly cautious and in a certain regard rigid spirituality that says, I think it's tough because I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this because the saints would always say that it's better in a questionable circumstance to err on the side of caution to avoid sin. But I've also seen that tendency to try to avoid is part of what got us in this situation in the first place. Like, there's a few sources, and actually everybody's probably going to think of them immediately, that I hate to say it, even though I disagree with them, and I don't always think they're accurate, I'm almost kind of glad they're out there, even though they're not. I don't agree with them. I generally would say they're even bad for your spirituality. But what we now know, some of those sources were covering this story 2 years ago before McCarrick. And maybe not all of the time, but at least some of the time they were right.
Mm-hmm. So we have to look at all things and test all things. So even that's why I feel like when people say that the source is bad, I tend to try to look at the source and say, okay, well, what in the actual article could be correct and could not be correct. You know what I mean? Like what is bias and what is actual fact? Because sometimes bad sources have actual truth in there somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's important for us to sometimes like the boy who cries wolf is actually crying wolf.
Exactly.
And we need to assess wisely.
And this is the really hard part for me of all of this to swallow, is that for the most part, if McCarrick hadn't slept with an underage boy, and that was the only thing that he did that was illegal, we wouldn't have known about the rest.
Right.
Like, if that hadn't happened, he could have died with honors and they would have given a good eulogy that he was a wonderful man. And it's like,
well, and it's not that that's the only thing that happened. It's the one thing that was an allegation that was
well, that's why the story broke.
right.
If you remember,
right.
So they didn't even, and many news sources didn't even cover the rest.
Yeah.
They just covered that. Some of the mainstream news sources, because technically, and this is actually one of the issues that's come out with the scandal. A lot of people. So in my own diocese, it's been clear that that my diocese was very good and vigilant about dealing with illegal activity with minors. But what people voice concerns about, I think, is a larger question, is how is immorality dealt with in general? And I'm still trying to work this out, and I'm open to conversations about it, because many people seem to think that immorality is not being dealt with effectively within the church. And McCarrick would be the prime example that we can all say is, we all agree is 100% true. Everything that's been written is pretty accurate. At least that's the consensus. I don't think anybody's denying that. And really, when all is said and done, the only reason why they're talking about removing him, laicizing him, and punishing him is because he broke one law. But all of the other immorality with the seminarians and stuff like that, for the most part, appears that it wouldn't have got him in trouble. Which, yeah. I don't know if we were planning on talking about this. I wasn't planning on talking about this.
No, I was not planning on talking about this. But that's what we are having a live conversation about real things, and about millstones and what Jesus says is going to happen to those who cause other people to sin, and whoever does these things to the little ones. So, which is when we're talking about the scandal, like that's one of the biggest things that they causing these little ones harm. And in reference to the millstones, it's Prophet Micah. It's 7:19 is the destination. In throwing them into the sea, that is where the destination of all of our sins go.
Yeah.
From Prophet Micah. So that's one of the references that I forgot to mention earlier.
Yeah. There's a certain poeticness to what he's talking about that would have evoked the prophets. Well, I hate to end on that sad note, but I think the big thing was, for me, is what I've believed in doing, and I think what we've been doing, is kind of processing all of this week by week. I mean, I find even just every time we have this conversation, I feel less anxious. I feel a little bit more at peace. Like, I feel like we're dealing with it.
Yeah, we're processing it, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be just grumbling under our breath to each other, you know what I mean, or to ourselves. We're talking about it. We're having a live conversation in front of other people about it, and they can tell us how they feel about it too. And that's how we should be getting through these things psychologically, emotionally, in the church, like processing them, so then we can be prepared and not completely like paralyzed by what's going on. Okay, are you ready for
closing prayer? We'll do comments and then we'll do closing prayer. Yeah.
All right, so Jen says, great. She says, oh, that's the other one. The great is everywhere. She says, yes, millstones are trending at the moment.
It's like during their hurricane, they sell out of water. During this crisis, they're selling out of millstones.
So Jennifer Convery says, I love that. We need some poets and contemplatives. Yep. My poetry stretches things.
That's what poets do.
That's true.
It's also what gets them in trouble.
I'm always in trouble. All right. And Joseph says he's here from Australia. Thank you for joining us, Joseph.
Thanks. All
right. And no one gave me any prayers. And I asked for them twice. So if you came in late, I apologize for not asking them right before the gospel. But I do have intentions. The seminarians that I got to know when we were stationed in Italy are being ordained deacons this week.
Nice.
So please pray for their ordination in St. Peter's Basilica during this crazy time. It is a little bit overwhelming for them. So please pray for them.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll pray for them and for other intentions in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we just ask in a special way that you overshadow the deacons about to be ordained or the soon-to-be deacons, seminarians. Just give them consolation in this time of trial. Give them a sense of their mission, that they'll be forces to renew the church, that they'll be forces to fight corruption. And we also pray in a special way for our Holy Father, for our bishops, and for all those affected by the crisis. And we pray also for some folks in my parish that gave me intentions, folks who are dying, folks who are sick. And we just entrust all of this to the Blessed Virgin Mary's care as we pray together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. The Lord be with you.
With your spirit.
And Almighty God bless you, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
All right.